My name is Basil Siokos, and I'm the Director of Programming for Doc NYC. Welcome to this Q&A for Boys State, which is part of the shortlist section, which recognizes 15 of the year's leading documentaries. Joining me are the film's directors, Amanda McBlaine and Jesse Moss. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Basil.
So I'm going to just start with a couple of foundational questions about the project. What was your entry point to Boys State as a concept, and specifically to the Texas event over any of the other state programs?
Yeah, well, I think our first entry point was trying to wrestle with the political division in our country, which I think we all see as profound and not going away. And this was about 3 years ago, shortly after Donald Trump was elected president, as filmmakers just trying to make sense of that and thinking, how can we confront this question of division, partisanship, polarization, and discovering Texas Boys State, which is part of this whole Boys and Girls State program sponsored by the American Legion. In every state except Hawaii, young people 17 get together and build governments from the ground up. And we discovered that in Texas, the boys had that year, 2017, voted to secede from the United States, which we knew was a kind of provocative and sort of reckless act, but really kind of telling of that division that we were curious about. And we didn't know much about the program, just as sort of vaguest contours, but thought, what an interesting space that they bring together young people with different politics from all over the state of Texas to try to work together. And we wondered, is that even possible in this day and age? And what would that space look like? What would it feel like? Could we make a film there? And that was the departure point to start the Boys State Project.
And so because of that 2017 Texas incident, was it always going to be Texas for you, or would you have moved on to another state if they said, no, we don't want to have you here for this?
No, we were all in on Texas, and partly because of that, the secession vote, partly because the Texas program is massive, unsurprisingly, and partly because Texas itself is fascinating politically, as we have now seen. It is a battleground, and we were interested in that for all of those reasons.
And so talk me through finding your main subjects. Did you have a certain number of boys you were looking to follow? What factored into who you cast, as it were? And at what point did you, like, we see some of the students, some of the boys like at their schools or whatever, but others come on board later. So like, what was that process like?
It was daunting. It was the big challenge of this film because the event itself is an intense but finite thing. We knew we needed to be as prepared as possible before it even got started, and that meant crewing assembling a huge group of people who were going to help us make the film. It also meant finding some of the folks we were going to immerse ourselves with, and we had 1,100 people to pick from. So we spent about 4 months traversing Texas, talking to everybody practically, and filming in Texas and trying to find kids who had different politics and also different backgrounds and different points of view. And I think we did. We found 3 of our main subjects. We were filming 6, but of course 3 ended up being the ones we really focused on. And then one, Renee, we met in the film the way you meet him in the film when he stands up and gives this extraordinary speech. And we knew you must also be part of our film.
And what, like, I guess, with so much going on, were the boys just like, sure, whatever, you're following me around? Or was it a thing? Was it a thing that, they had to explain why the cameras were there and what they were doing, or was it just sort of like, just they're busy with everything else going on in this intense powder keg of an event?
I think as film subjects, they were just naturally kind of confident and comfortable with who they are. Also vulnerable, though, which is, I think, something you need with a documentary subject. Somebody who's both comfortable with that attention, but also being themselves, which they were very much. And that was clear in the casting process with Robert and Stephen and Ben, who we all chose in advance. But I think once the event got started, as Amanda said, it's so big, so complicated, moves so quickly that there's also other cameras, that there's a news network within Boys State, which is covering the news. And so sort of in all of this, we sort of just blended in. And I think that they were so focused on what they were doing, building parties, running for office, brokering deals, trying to sort of use underhanded tactics to to win the election, that I think we didn't disappear, because you never disappear as documentary filmmakers. But I think that we receded, and I think they were focused on what they needed to do at Boise State. So it was great. It was really what we love about unscripted filmmaking is sort of building that relationship of trust, and then sort of holding on tight as life unfolds in front of you in all the crazy, surprising ways that it does.
And on that note, sort of just the massive scale of what's happening there. Like when did you know sort of what you'd focus on? If you can run me through sort of your process and sort of, there's a lot going on. There's the legislative sessions where they're proposing both frivolous and serious laws, but there is also the campaigning that's going on for the governor and the governorship, et cetera, that aspect of it. And the film primarily seems to focus on the governorship, but obviously there's elements of these other things in there. So, was that an editorial, was that a choice during the editing, or as you were filming, you just kind of got as much as you could and it honed in as you went along?
We knew going in that we were going to follow the governor's race, but I assume that had one of our characters not ended up in the middle of that, we probably would have had to pivot. But for, to our great fortune, like Stephen and Ben both, actually all of them out of the gate really went for that position. And then as you see in the film, Ben and Stephen both struggled. The first time we thought, we're going to lose our two of these kids. We've invested so much of we're so in love with them, like this can't happen. And then to their credit, they pivoted. But we did stick with that race. But of course, the real challenge then became Ben and Renee and the creation of these state parties, and to what degree those positions then influence the governor's race. To braid those all together it's complicated. Government's complicated. I'd say the one piece that kind of receded was the legislature, which is such an incredible space. Very bright kids end up there. None of our main characters did. And that's really a space where the conversation and compromise was really, happening on a daily basis once kids started, actually, even in the jokey laws, they really had to debate those too.
But I think, we wanted to see what, particularly for these young men who come into the program who are young men of color, who are politically progressive, which is not like most of the boys there who are white and conservative. We wanted to see, first of all, could they find their voice? Could they find support? Could they reach across and connect with these boys who are very much not like them? I think that was part of what we were interested in exploring. And I think that's the question we're asking ourselves as a country, is like, can we make these connections? Can we find common ground? Can we forge compromise? What does that look like? And if 17-year-olds can do it, maybe the grown-ups can do it too. And I think watching that process through an electoral campaign through the eyes of Stephen Garza, who's a son of an undocumented immigrant, who's a Bernie Sanders supporter, but he's trying to reach boys who are really right of center. And I think that process became, it sort of held our attention. And I think it holds the audience's attention because we recognize what the stakes are. They're not just the stakes of Boise State. They're not just the stakes for Stephen of becoming the next governor of Boise State. They're really our stakes as a country. And so when that emerged, we knew that's where our attention should be.
And I wonder with the level of sort of political know-how and knowledge that these kids have. This is an observational film, obviously, and so you're seeing what this current crop of kids were doing. But you must have researched the program to some extent. Was Boise State always sort of this kind of polarized and contentious? When did it, and if not, when did it start to sort of reflect the polarization of our country in that same way? These kids certainly, it's in Texas, but as you said, Texas is complicated. It's not just a uniform one thing. There's a lot of different pockets going on here. And so I wonder, 2017, obviously there's the secession, but was it always kind of like a contentious space specifically, in that program?
Well, in 2017, they voted to secede from the Union. That is the first time they've done that in the 80 years of the program. So that's something. That says something to the kind of fever pitch that we've reached in this way. It's also an organic space where every year things are sort of in flux. A couple of years before we got there, the big debate was speed limits, so we knew going in that guns were going to be a big issue, but I didn't quite see that, the degree of polarization and that kind of conversation I think was special to the year that we were there. That being said, then the year we filmed, they didn't vote to secede again, or whatever the next step beyond secession is, full civil war. They voted to, the big vote that year was universal background check bill. So like, it's really interesting how this kind of back and forth.
I think it's a really sensitive kind of petri dish of the mood of the country. And I mean, it's 1,000 young people. And that's what makes it fascinating. And it has its own kind of organic energy. And so, I mean, and we just witnessed this last week in the election. It's there's so much kind of uncertainty and coursing through all of us. And I think that we knew that the feelings would be strong. And in fact, what drew us to the boys we did follow is we asked them, how do you feel about polarization? And how they answered that question told us how much they were thinking about the country, about their own politics, about their place in our democracy. And that's why we were drawn to these guys, because they're all really serious about it. They take it really, not everybody at Boys State does. You see that in the film. There's some clowns, there's some jokers, there's some goof-offs. There are everywhere. But these kids, for them, it's really everything. And I think that's what we connected with too. They really care.
And did you get a sense, and this was outside of the purview probably of your project, but did you get a sense from other boys or girls states that year or in subsequent years of how, like, is that polarization being felt across the board with all of these programs as far as you know?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this generation we know is growing up with confronting these existential threats, be it gun violence or climate change. And we see them on the streets and participating in Black Lives Matter protests and leading climate change marches. Our daughter, is 14, and she's already out in the streets in ways that maybe you were, Basil, but we were not, I think, at that age. And I think that politicization, that sense that they cannot wait for the adults to fix their problems, is coursing through them. And we see that expressed, certainly we saw it in Texas, and I think we see it everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking to Girl State programs now, and it's a similar conversation because that's what we're going to do next. And, that will continue to be the conversation for this age group for I don't know how long.
Yeah. So moving away a little bit from that to some of the more production-oriented things, which I'm very curious about. And you mentioned this, you built up a big team, a big crew to sort of do this project with you. I don't think everybody necessarily understands the monumental undertaking that this was. And I just would love for you to run down a little bit of sort of what a day was like there, what the hours were, how many people were on your crew, how you divided the roles between not only you, but folks following the four boys. There's a lot going on. And just if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, the film before this was The Overnighters, which I filmed by myself with a crew of none. And Amanda and I and our editor, Jeff Gilbert, really made together 3 people. This film was, we had this big canvas, this short period of time. We had a crew of 28. We brought these fantastic cinematographers from New York, Claudia Raschke, Martina Radwan, Wolfgang Held, Torsten Thilo. Just like this kind of super group of people who do this kind of work. And we had to empower them to kind of go out and capture this. We paired them all up with our subjects. And we, as directors, had to really kind of surrender some ego, which is hard as a director. I think we're used to kind of controlling everything, right? And also the relationship with our subjects. We needed to empower our cinematographers to really develop those relationships themselves, and then to kind of somehow manage to stay on top of everything that was happening. And I can't say that that it was a rational process, but I think that, like, great filmmaking, or if I can say, sort of lives on the edge of chaos. And I think you have to be comfortable getting to that place where you can plan and prepare and have experience and bring in the people you trust, and then you have to surrender yourself to what comes. And I think we loved making a movie this way. I don't know that we want to make every movie this had to be made this way. Mm-hmm. I don't think it could have been made any other way. And I'd love to find, hopefully Girl State, which we're going to do next, will make in a similar fashion with hopefully the same team, because we love them.
That's great. And would that be Girl State in Texas, or are you thinking of other places potentially, other places?
No, I think it'll necessarily be another state. To differentiate in all ways.
Maybe Pennsylvania, maybe Georgia.
Yeah,
these other battleground states would be really interesting.
Sure.
Definitely. Before we wrap up, I know that the boys were on the festival circuit for whatever festival circuit we've had this year, as it were, but participating in some Q&As and things like that, and we're at Sundance. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how they prepared for and responded to the spotlight that this puts on them, especially since the film has now come out and has been available very wide? Can you talk a little bit about sort of how it may have how they may have changed or how it may have impacted them in some ways? It's been a couple of years, obviously, since they've been part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny business. You shoot the film and then we go away and we're looking at their faces for like a year. It took us a year to edit this movie. But then we re-enter, then we share a rough cut with them. And then this whole very intense conversation continues forward for another long period of time. They are all very comfortable talking. Like, not surprisingly, they are great. I mean, they're way better. I always wish like we could just have them do every Q&A because they're so fantastic and they're so different from one another. And frankly, their conversation with one another continues to just enrich my life in ways like every single time we get together. So they have all had different journeys through the Boy State and then watching the film that is Boy State. And I'd say probably the most profound of them, you really watch everybody. The Boy State itself as an event is kind of a crucible. So you really do see some of them radically change within that program. But then I think for Ben, maybe you can talk about sort of Ben's reflection after the fact has been one of the more profound, I say, chapters of the making of this film.
Well, I think what we've discovered, which has been so valuable, is that the space that was created through this program of bringing people together with different politics to mostly engage civilly. It's not all civil, and you see that in the film. There's some dark, rough stuff in the movie, and I think that's true to our politics. We know it's out there, and not surprisingly, we saw it in Texas. But I think that bringing them all together, their politics are very different. They're across the political spectrum, but they're still kind of coming together and having a conversation about our country, about our democracy, about their roles in it. And like, I think they're modeling kind of what we all need and hope for. They don't always agree, right? But they engage civilly. And, we're speaking at a moment in which, on the front page is what seems to be fairly uncivil conduct. And I think it's really, I don't think they think that's just who they are. And they're very comfortable kind of having a civil conversation. And like Ben, Amanda suggested, Ben has really kind of grown with some, he's had a kind of moral awakening, which he didn't have at Boy State, about practicing dirty tricks to help his party win the governorship. And I think that's been really profound to see, because it was one of the questions we had going into this project was like, how fixed are their political identities? And also, how much have they internalized the discourse that they see coming at them every day from Washington? Has that contaminated our politics irrevocably? And I think that Ben's growth has really been a kind of a hopeful thing, because it's one of the darker aspects of the story is his tactics. But I think his willingness to kind of confront his own behavior has filled us with some optimism.
I mean, he sees where he's not only 2 years older, obviously the country is also 2 years further into this thing. And I think he sees the vulnerabilities that we're in as a democracy. And for him and his deep patriotism, I think that win at all costs strategy, I think he recognizes may win you things, but then you're left with what? A damaged body politic. And that is something that he's very concerned about.
And my last question is basically, and I know they're still very young, but do they still have any kind of political aspirations, even on the sort of like college level or whatever they're doing right now? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think people think of this program as being a springboard to electoral office, like Bill Clinton famously went on, went through the program, became president, and people like, other people famously. But I think that we've discovered that they've taken very different but still very important paths to engagement. So Stephen Garza just worked on a congressional campaign in Texas this past cycle, very much focused on that track. Renee Otero who's a brilliant politician and orator, clearly could have a bright future. He's focused on community activism around issues of racial justice. Like, that's where he feels like he wrote a beautiful op-ed for the New York Times about activism and how that's the path he's taken. Ben is focused on national security, and he's eager to work.
He's learning Russian.
He's learning Russian. Bless him. And Robert's at West Point. So I think what's beautiful is they've all found different paths to service is important. Engagement is important. And that's inspiring, that's sort of the lesson that democracy is not a spectator sport, and that you have to, and it's not just, it's beyond voting too. It's about finding other ways to be involved. I think they've all shown us that there are as many paths as there are people.
Well, this does have to bring us to an end, but I want to say once again, this is one of my favorite films this year, and I'm so happy that it's able to be part of Doc NYC, and I think it remains incredibly relevant and will continue to remain relevant for many years to come. But we do have to wrap it up here. I want to thank you both, Amanda and Jesse, for speaking with me today, and again, thanks for having Boys State be part of Doc NYC.
Thank you.